fashion supply chains and approach towards a more socio-ecological just fashion industry. And Patrick Alpha will present. He's from the Middlesex University. And he will be the first to present, and then we'll just after Patrick presents, Clarice Santos, also from Middlesex University, will present a talk called, with name Inequality at the Margins, Rethinking Community, Work and Family in Urban Space Through a Transdisciplinary Lens. So we'll begin with Patrick, and then we go to Clarice, and maybe we get questions after both presentations.
Yeah.
Isn't it better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's do that.
Okay, so let's begin, Christian. Vamos empezar, ¿eh? Gracias.
Great. So thank you so much for having us, Carlos. Thank you to you and your team here at UERJ in Rio de Janeiro. Also, warm welcome from my side. Good afternoon, right? Because I think some of you are in Spain and somewhere across London, across Europe. So my name is Patrick. I'm an associate professor in sustainable business at Middlesex University, London, and I thought it might be an interesting, hopefully an interesting presentation today to give you an overview of some of the research that we have conducted here in Brazil, but also how it started in the UK. So the focus will really be on a case, explore the inequality that the fashion supply chains, the global fashion supply chains induce into our global societies. If you can't see my slides, please do let me know, because I want you to be able to follow the presentation, okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, okay. It's okay. It's okay.
Perfetto. So, good. Just a few examples of how unequal the fashion industry really is. It's really an inherent feature of the global fashion supply chain. I just want to include a few examples here. Overall, there are 92 million tons of textile waste that's generated each year. And even though they are produced in some of the countries, as usually in the global south, they are consumed in the global north, and then the waste is brought back to exactly these places where they are sometimes produced. So some of the pictures that you see on the right illustrate it a little bit. In the south, you see actually a picture from a landfill site in sub-Saharan Africa. On the I was about to say northeast. On the top right, you see a picture from the Rana Plaza disaster in 2007, where many thousand, well, 1,200 people actually died, and no big brand assumed responsibility. Sometimes because they simply didn't know that they produced in a factory. And there are also other examples that apply to the Latin American context. So, for instance, the beautiful Atacama Desert in Chile, some parts of it, they have become a dumping ground for some of the garments that are produced in the global south, but consumed in the global north, mainly in the US in that case, but also in Europe. So those are just a few examples of how unequal not only the consumption, the production, but also the consumption and the effects are that occur as part of the wider fashion supply chain. So there's a lot in here on that slide, and I just included a little bit more detail for you to maybe engage with afterwards. What's important to really understand here is that there's an incredibly unequal wage distribution. So even though that most people work very long hours in Bangladesh and also other manufacturing hubs, they receive very often not even the value of one particular shoe. So I'll give you one example. There's a Nike shoe that I saw yesterday as one example that costs around $130. That shoe has a value, in inverted commas, that is higher than the monthly pay, a wage of a person working in some of these factories. And that person at the same time produced between 70 and 130 shoes per day. So it gives you a sense of how unequal the wage distribution is, how unequal the profit is actually distributed. But it doesn't stop there necessarily, because the injustices, you could also saw that in cases such as the COVID-19 pandemic, where many of these garments orders were cancelled last minute very often, and the responsibility was not really taken by the big brands who are making a lot of money with it. They were actually, a lot of the workers, they were stranded. They were not able to generate any income. And I know that the COVID pandemic was very difficult for most of us, but I think the reality looked very different for some and for others. So whereas countries in the global north paid people some money to actually come by and were able to still consume to fulfill our needs, that was very often not the case in the global south context. And I just want to slowly move into the context of Latin America and introduce you to also some of the work that we're doing here in Brazil and some of the work that we have been doing over the last couple of years in Bangladesh and India. And one of the other examples that I also include in that slide here is that we are very often, when I say we, I refer to the global north context. We in the global north context are very often not aware of some of these inequalities. And a lot of the clothes that are produced, a lot of fashion that is produced in these contexts are produced in very informal and precarious sectors. And precarity is a key word here. It's also the focus of our research, how we can actually tackle that precarity. And I just want to offer a short working definition that we use. So we define precarity as a chronic insecurity, economic, physical, and social one, which describes the lived reality of workers who lack contracts, protection, or long-term job security. So it basically means that if you work in a precarious working condition, you don't have access to a stable income, there's a lack of social mobility, so you will not be able to access education, proper housing, really successfully satisfy your needs that would then allow you to actually improve your working or your life conditions. It also very often doesn't allow you to have a political voice and participate in the everyday life. And you will hear a little bit more about that in the context of Brazil as well, because there are major manufacturing hubs in São Paulo where slave-like conditions exist, because sometimes you have migrants from Bolivia and the passports are taken away, because that enables then big factory owners to ensure that they are continuously working in that factory under very precarious conditions for many, many years to come. So I know that I have limited time today, and I did that similar talk once in an hour, so I have to squeeze in a bit here and rush ahead, but I'm happy to answer any sort of questions afterwards if there are any. So I also want to give you a brief overview of where that work started, because I work in a business school, in a business and law school in London, and I work on organizational change, on all sorts of other things. However, fashion was never really on my radar. I'm not a very fashionable person, but I was thrown into that because of a project that we did in 2018 for 3 years together with the University of the Arts London. So it was a 3-year project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So that's what AHRC stands for. And the name of it was Rethinking Fashion, Design, Entrepreneurship, Fostering Sustainable Practices. And fostering sustainable practices was a very interesting project because it started prior to the pandemic, but also allowed us to conduct research and collect data during the pandemic. So it was very interesting to understand how that shifted, how the working conditions shifted, and it allowed us to come up with to write a few articles. You see an overview here, and the focus of these publications is very different to what we research now, but it was a starting point. It also allowed us to give us access to the global fashion supply chain actors. So just as an overview, and please feel free to also send me an email in case you're interested to read any of that. I think most of the publications are actually open access, but for instance, the book chapter at the bottom is not. So if you're interested do let me know. More than happy to share a copy. So very briefly, because I want to focus more on our ICASI focus, which is Latin America and Europe, obviously. But I also want to give you an example of some recent research that we did in India and Bangladesh. It was a one-year project funded by Access, which is part funded by, again, the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK. And in the project, we explored factors that can offer, that can really facilitate greater equality across this global fashion supply chain and allow workers to make a living and to really tackle the precarious working conditions they face on a daily basis. During the project, we worked very closely with fashion brands, but especially with people who actually produce the textiles in India and Bangladesh in more sustainable factories. So they're very often provided better working conditions, access to health insurance, access to a bank account, which is not something usual in India, for instance, where only men usually have access to bank accounts. So we started working with them, and we then understood in the process that one of the very often overlooked actors are buyers. So those are basically the people who, not the consumers. Sorry, I have to clarify that. When I say buyers, it's not the consumer, it's actually the fashion buyers that buy big chunks of clothes for bigger brands. So they are in the middle of the supply chain. And a lot of the research that we do focuses very often on creating interventions that have a focus on the consumer or on the brand, but not on these middlemen that hold a lot of power. So currently we're in the process to develop a new research proposal that targets these buyers and hopefully changes their buying practices to unlock some of the potential for more sustainable fashion. And then I really wanted to focus on the work that we are conducting currently here in Brazil, that the ICASI project also really supported. Thanks to this secondment, I was able to build my network, to also do a technical visit in some of these places. And it helped me to develop contacts at USP. So I did one secondment there and now in Rio, but also with other universities in Brazil that are based or work already in these contexts. For instance, the Federal University of Pernambuco, UFPE, Federal University of Campina Grande in Paraíba, and others. And here, the project really focuses on the precarity of fashion at the bottom of the pyramid. So again, the poorest people working in these contexts. What I have to mention straight away is that the fashion system here in Brazil, the fashion supply chains, it's not necessarily international, at least not as much as the fashion supply chain in India and in Bangladesh. So the fashion that is produced here is mainly produced for the national market in comparison with India and Bangladesh. And that is interesting because you can put less pressure on these brands because they produce for the domestic market, but not internationally. So you can not use the consumer in the global north to put pressure on these brands. You have a very different power dynamic in place. And it took some time to understand it. And we also try to understand, okay, what are the mechanisms then that we can activate in and through our research to change that status quo. And I will speak a little bit more about that. I already mentioned it on this slide here because we started engaging with a group. It's called Coletivo Mulheres de Polo do Agreste, which is basically a female collective that came together and tries to really have a voice, a joint voice, and change local legislation and improve their working conditions through collective action. And I can maybe speak a little bit more in the next couple of minutes. The focus here is also really on business models and how they induce, again, precarity. And that's the reason why we call it violent business models, why we use that as a working title for our project. I will speak a little bit more, not in the next slide, but the slide after. But for those of you who are interested in understanding a little bit more of how severe the situation is on the one hand, but also on on the wider dynamics that are involved in the production and consumption, I would really suggest that you try to find that documentary. I'm not sure if it's even a documentary, if I can call it that, but it's a very interesting film about what's called the Triángulo das Bermudas. So there's a little bit of a cheeky title here, because Bermudas, what they mean by that is actually the genes, the Bermuda, right?
Yeah.
So it's the Bermuda Triangle, which consists of 3 cities in the northeast of Brazil, consisting of Caruaru in Pernambuco, Toritama on the border of Pernambuco and Paraíba, and Santa Cruz de Capibaribe. Those are 3 cities, fairly small actually, but they produce an awful lot of jeans, especially jeans, but also other fashion products. And it's quite interesting because the resources, the materia prima, that comes from places like São Paulo, Minas Gerais, but so they actually don't grow any cotton, they don't grow any resource in that sense, but it's still an incredibly strong fashion cluster up there in the northeast, because the government has something, like what's it called in English, a gentleman's agreement, where they just look away. So they make a contribution to the GDP of the country. There's a lot of informality as well, yes, but they look away because they allow these cities to produce these products. So we call it violent business models because that Uberization of the business model really induces different types of violence. So what do I mean by Uberization? By Uberization obviously comes from the term Uber, right? We're very aware nowadays what Uber has done to our positive and negative to our lives, provides us consumers with more flexibility, better prices and whatnot. But for the people who actually offer the service and the wider economy, they are also negative. There's a downside to it. So very often it's a platform, right? So the platform takes away some middlemen as part of the previous supply chain and offers the person who offers the service in turn more flexibility, more autonomy. That's at least the storyline. But at the same time, they take away some of the benefits that come with a stable employment, right? Health insurance, again, a stable income, other job securities. And that is something that doesn't only exist or happen in the service sector, like transport service sector, like Uber itself. It also happens in the case of the fashion sector here. So how does it happen? In the Northeast, but also in other places, a lot of people work in informal settings. That means they produce at home. They produce literally in the porch of their building under, again, very precarious working conditions, because there's no environmental regulation. A lot of the coloring of the washing goes straight into the water. The water is used at the same time to feed the animals for drinking water purpose as well. So you can just imagine the both societal but also environmental consequences it has for other local environments. So that is one sort of violence that occurs. And then there's also a lot of psychological violence because a lot of the women that work in these informal settings, they were now accused as lazy sawyers, because on the one hand, they have all the flexibility in the world to work whenever they want, but they're still trying to improve their working conditions when they come together in these collectives, for instance. So there's a lot of psychological violence happening as well, or bullying, or what we call here in Brazil, assédio moral, that creates really conditions that do not allow them to improve their disequality and the precarity of the working conditions. I already spoke about the physical violence, the environmental hazards that come with the lack of legislation, or the lack of enforced legislation, because the legislation is in place, but it's not enforced. And the government, as I said, is looking away because of that gentleman's agreement, and is not really taking care of enforcing these laws. So there are numerous emerging insights, and there are also a lot of possible research directions that we might or might not take. I would take some time to reflect on that, to discuss that with all the collaborators here. And I mentioned already a few of them. One thing that I really wanted to briefly mention is that what we found in our research, is that I think you.
Yeah,
Oh,
sorry.
Thanks.
It was mistaken.
No problem. That we found that there's actually a role of religion in all of that. So when you go into that Bermuda Triangle in the Northeast, a lot of the informality is maintained through religion. And that was something that we didn't expect. So there is a lot of solidarity that comes with it, but it comes in different forms. So for instance, I mentioned the collective, the women's collective. There's a solidarity that comes about through shared attempt to improve the working conditions. But the other women who don't want to engage with these collectives, they usually don't want to engage with them because it's seen as something that goes against their values and their religion for some reason. And we only started to scratch the surface and want to now conduct a better investigation to understand how religion and the solidarity that comes with religion and with value systems, how they, on the one hand, can maintain that inequality, or how they can actually help to break that inequality. So I think that is something that we will explore in the next couple of months. And the other thing that we realize is that human unions are mostly powerless in these contexts. They are very often incredibly powerless. And I think that is something that I just wanted to briefly mention, because I know that many of our colleagues as part of INCASI do research on unions as well. And it was something that I thought was quite interesting to see, at least in that context in the Northeast. I'm not generalizing here because I know too little about it across Brazil. Usually the unions were quite strong here in the country. But in that case, they were not able to change the working conditions over the last 20 odd years. So almost to conclude with, because I only have 2 or 3 more slides, I briefly want to introduce you to our research partner that we made now, which is the Women's Collective that I mentioned before. And I want to tell you a little bit more about what they do. They don't only come together to have a shared voice, but they also use it as an exploratory space to understand together, to develop an understanding together of what it means to have a dignified work, to educate each other about many things. For instance, to learn what is assedio moral, what is bullying, what is harassment, because very often it is completely normalized in these working conditions that you are treated in a rather cruel way, to be honest. But they also want to educate each other through capability building, to be able to produce better clothes that perhaps enters a different market, not the mass market, but a market with a slightly higher price point that then allows them to get a better salary, and that then hopefully can also trigger better social mobility. And as I mentioned, it's also an activist space, so they want to have a shared voice. And the last one is really the collective as a political actor. The leader of the collective, she is a really outspoken voice, was invited to Brasilia as well to speak to the federal government, to support new legislations. And that is quite interesting because that collective is fairly small and it certainly operates only on the margins in a niche, but there are more and more collectives springing up, and we're interested in finding out how, not scaling up, but scaling out, scaling wide, can actually allow them to drive change and to drive change in many different places across the country. So yeah, there will be quite a few reflections over the next couple of months, and I just jotted down a few here. I spoke about them already, so I can probably really jump that slide. I also know that I'm running out of time, so I think I will just leave it there and give Clarice a minute more or so.
Okay.
But if you want to get in touch, please reach out. That's my email. I will also put it in the chat in a moment. And yeah, I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Patrick. Very interesting research. So now we go to Clarice's presentation, and then we open to this debate. I'm gonna put okay. Liga o seu microfone também. Eu vou te ligar aqui.
Hi, everybody. Let me just upload my presentation here. Let's see if it's... Oh, here we go.
Muito interessante sua pesquisa. Bom, muito interessante. Eu fui impressionado que uma das pessoas mais ricas do mundo é o dono de uma loja de roupa, né? Da Zara, né? Essas lojas que pessoas que produzem não quase nada. Isso é uma loucura. E muita coisa jogada fora, né?
Could you see the presentation or the presentation view?
No.
Or okay, here, I think. See if that works.
No.
Yeah?
Probably get the margin.
No, yeah.
Yeah, okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to present this ongoing project here. Thank you to Carlos for being our host here at UERJ. Thank you, Nkazi, Christian, for organizing this here. Thank you, Patrick, for being our PI at Middlesex too, for bringing the opportunity to us there. So it's really a pleasure to be here talking about this project as somebody who is from Rio, and in a way I've been I'm going to tell you a little bit about the project that we've been working on at Middlesex, and then how that led to a project that's focused within the Rio context, which is really where my passion for research lies in. So this picture is very representative. It's been talked about as one of the pictures that most represent inequality within our context. It's part of this exhibit called Unequal Spaces by Johnny Miller, but it's a replica of a picture taken by Tuca Vieira in about 20 years ago from above, showing Morumbi, a neighborhood in São Paulo next to Paraisópolis. So a contrast that we see quite often in urban spaces and metropolitan areas. This one here in São Paulo, but we have similar photos on this exhibit, but similar experiences within the Rio de Janeiro context. And we see that in Cape Town and many other places. And I mention Cape Town because we're hoping to develop this project into part of a South-to-South dialogue, where we work with South Africa as well. So I'll tell you a little bit about what the project entails and the way that this secondment has allowed me to dive deeper into creating the connections to make this possible. But first, I wanted to break down this title a little bit, in addition to talking about inequality in marginalized spaces, why I'm using the term community work and family, and why through a transdisciplinary lens. So community work and family, I'm part of the editorial team in a journal called Community Work and Family that brings together several disciplines, including sociology, psychology, management, and we talk about the intersections between community and work, community and family, family and work. So in this journal, our focus is to combine at least two of these in ways that we know that things happen in systems anyway. So this is a way for us to see how these can operate within diverse contexts, and especially in really rapidly changing environments. And we do, as much as possible, try to take a look at more work coming out of the Global South, because the journal has been very much Global North dominated. And then slowly, through changing the editorial team, we're also getting more participation from writers from the Global South. We had a conference that I was chair of in Rio, and it was the first one in Latin America. And it was the 9th International Community Work and Family Conference here in Rio de Janeiro 2 years ago. And we're producing a special issue that talks about a lot of those issues that I hope to bring up today that have to do with networks of care, especially in low-income areas, in peripheries, or in slum areas in Rio, for example. So that's about inclusive community work and family. And we talk about this future-looking lens as a way to discuss change, but not removing the local context and locals' voices from what we do. And why a transdisciplinary lens? I work in a transdisciplinary team, and usually we mean that we connect with non-academic actors in the way that we co-produce knowledge. And the idea is to move away from silos, in particular in how we engage with grand challenges, and inequality being one of them. And the hope is to be able to recenter marginalized voices and to look at the complexity of how inequality and several of the issues that we find today, whether they have to do with gender inequality, with climate issues, migration issues, a lot of them are functioning within a very complex context where change is currently occurring. So the idea of allowing methods to be varied is something that we try to propose. And one of the key ideas is about co-designing and co-producing with the communities that identify the problems that they have. So we hope to have solutions that are very grounded on the issues that are identified and addressed by communities. So this is something that I consider often because of doing mixed methods design, is how we can strengthen the quantitative data that we get with the aspects from the transdisciplinary approaches that I'll be talking about in a bit, which often align with decolonial and feminist approaches as well. But the idea is, how can we explain some of the patterns that we see, whether they're about gender pay gaps, education outcomes? How do we make the silences and stigma and some of those issues that maybe surveys could miss, how do we complement them? How do we inform some of the metrics that we use? How we're able to tell stories? How do we talk about, for example, of new ways of working and what good work can be, rather than talk about employment, for example? So how do we complement information to tell these complex stories? And connecting some macro trends to microdynamics, which is why in our teams, we tend to be a combination of economists, management specialists, sociologists, etc., to try to get as many angles as we can to making sense out of what we're seeing. And also the positionality of the researcher and the reflexivity of the researcher themselves. So this is, I guess I'm sometimes an advocate for transdisciplinarity, also because I'm leading a program that's on transdisciplinarity as a way to deal with grand challenges. Also, other projects that relate to this, there is, I'm part of the UNESCO Futures Chair, and I'm the person who deals with gender inequality in that group. This is a paper that we did a presentation with my colleague from Kazakhstan, Arman Mazikeyev, about connecting data at a larger scale that is about gender inequality with whether a CEO or a leader of an organization was male or female, and trying to see how the macro data connects with measurements or proxy measurements of performance. We also have a project underway that looks more specifically at migrants. So that's a project of the UK and Brazil, and we're hoping we still don't have we'll know in December, fingers crossed, if we get that financed. And then the one that I'll discuss a little bit more today is looking at parenthood, and in particular motherhood. There is a group that's looking more at fatherhood in UK SMEs, and I'm trying now to do one that's focused on SMEs and urban spaces here in Rio, with some of the findings from, especially in terms of methods from that project. So that's a project that we got about £500,000 to work on, and it's part of Transforming Working Lives. in the UK. And I'll give you a sense of what it is that we looked at and then how that transfers into our context in Brazil. So this project is about new parenthood within small and medium-sized companies and how to support parents and influence legislation in the UK in this case. And that's how we got started. That's a partnership between Middlesex and a couple of other universities, Leeds and Manchester. And we also have support from ILO, from other work organizations, and trying to see if we can find ways to support organizations, especially small ones, in how they handle this transition that is a significant one in people's lives. One of the issues that we had in this project is that when we look at participants, we've been finding participants who tend to be in middle class or in knowledge workers, for example, and we've had lots of difficulties trying to see what are the challenges of people who maybe are not even having a voice in some of those projects. And it's been something that we're trying to address by different targeted recruitment and so on, but it's been quite difficult within the UK to get diversity in participant recruitment. So we combine this. This is a little bit more of the team that's working on it, and to show you also some of the non-academic colleagues that we're working with, including the International Labour Organization, Equality and Human Rights Commission, and this focus on small businesses as well, in addition to practice-based groups such as Working Families and the Fatherhood Institute. This is very focused on a very large business population that sometimes doesn't get the attention that it needs to get in terms of needs for leave and pregnancy support and childcare and other sorts of issues, especially because they don't have a dedicated HR department. And they end up dealing with very little, very few resources in terms of what they're able to do, especially in terms of staffing. It's the same reality that a lot of small organizations in Brazil have to deal with. This is a little bit more about the project itself and how it's been designed within the UK context. I wanted to, as I said, this was the beginning step for what we do in Brazil, but I won't go into details. The quantitative component, and it's something that we're hoping to replicate. It's 2 large-scale surveys that look at employees in large organizations and then also small organizations to try to see what are some of the norms and the understandings of legislation around parental leave. This connects with what's happening here in Brazil, which is a national policy of care and new legislation as well that addresses some of those issues within our context here. So we'll have some results of these, the quantitative and the qualitative UK project for anybody who'd like to know more. But in the Brazil context, we're trying to get some of that understanding about the work and the family interface, new configurations of families, different ways of working that include informal work, especially if we're talking about low-income communities. With the Política Nacional de Cuidados, the national care policy that's 2024, we're seeing a movement towards more concern about care, especially unpaid care that's provided in a lot of different contexts, especially low-income communities, where when one person cares for another, then there is a sequence of people who need to be able to support each other within a community. So some examples of the national care policy, it's a comprehensive coordinated care system. The idea to look into intersectionalities such as gender, race, and class inequalities, to try to make sure that those burdens that typically fall on women are recognized in care, and a redistribution is considered across different actors, and that there is a reduction on the unpaid care burdens that tend to fall on women, and to value this work with decent wages, with formalizing some of this work that care workers do. with this momentum, then it's a good time to proceed with different approaches to research. The networks of care that I'm talking about are often the informal, collective, the solidary ways in which people will help each other to take care of either family, children, the elderly, the disabled, the groups that may require different types of care. So we see this very present within communities in Brazil and in Rio de Janeiro, but they remain undervalued. They are critical. There's plenty of research that already talks about this in a wider context, but here in Brazil, it's something that we see an opportunity to engage with a bit more. Just noticing time, so I'll tell you what the project that I've been here developing and that the secondment has allowed to focuses specifically to understand how low-income mothers, specifically, that's why some of the work is about motherhood in the margin, navigate informal work, unpaid care, and inequality in general. We've been able to develop partnerships with an NGO called Solar Menino de Luz. It's interesting that Patrick also mentioned the role of religion, because the way they've been able to get closer to the way communities are working, it's usually through a religious NGO as well, or something that gives a sense of recognizes the diversity of religions within different spaces. This particular one is in the Copacabana neighborhood, and we've also found partners in small businesses. In this case, Jaume Berger employs a group of women from the community, and they've partnered with us to help support discussing with the women how their everyday lives is. We talk about also understanding the types of knowledge and expectations that they have, and it's focused on knowledge co-production. So it's about working with the communities, not necessarily on them. The methodologies we're using for the qualitative part, which is the one that requires a lot more relationship development, involve photo voice. So we're having participants use photography or their everyday lives, including the care commitments, and work to tell us what matters and what their life is like. We're using testimonial, which is also a narrative method, the storytelling method that's based on Latin American traditions, where they recount life stories to tell about their experience with, in many cases, structural violence and inequality. We're doing walking interviews, which is basically discussing, having conversations as we walk through spaces so we can understand the everyday lives of the participants. And we have focus groups where we ask participants to bring objects that mean something to them to help with storytelling. So a photo that was meaningful, an artifact, and they can talk about the experiences of care, of motherhood, or of their lives with those objects. And then we're working on workshops that also develop dialogue and collective analysis and to co-curate some of the outputs that will include an exhibit. So a lot of the time here has been on working with different groups to establish those. In terms of results, then I've had conversations with colleagues from UERJ, UF, UFRJ, and PUC-Rio about a combined approach for dealing with this project. A couple of funding applications have been worked on, including one that was submitted with this proposal, and capacity building in general, and building this transdisciplinary group, including smaller businesses like the Burger Joint and other joints that work with people from the communities, but also Instituto Coca-Cola and other organizations that have projects with low-income communities. So this has been quite helpful to be here in this space for that. And then potential outputs, as I said, includes a community exhibition, a public-facing blog or article, and other and traditional journal articles, including methods and the mixed methods we're using. And then these are all the other aspects. I'm not going to go into them, but this is more like the literature around what's these topics. And a lot of it is about solidarity too, which is something that Patrick mentioned as a collective and a way to deal with inequalities. here are some studies. One point that I wanted to make is that we have 20 potential participants already in some areas that have come up in pre-discussions have to do with gender-based violence in low-income communities, migration internally inside Brazil from the Northeast to Rio in search for opportunities, issue around how to deal with informal labor in case of pregnancy, and then and challenges with adoption too for those who have not had the opportunity of motherhood and the challenges of going through that process when you live in a low-income community. And this is just a piece that Bila Sorge, a sociologist here in Brazil, has a publication a while ago that talks about the ambiguity of these discourses, because at the same time, a project like ours, for example, talks about motherhood and the idea of care and nurturing. But at the same time, we're talking about a citizenship, a solidarity view that puts women as agents and that they can, and autonomous and political actors, and how hard it is to want to be transformative, but at the same time, we need to be careful about gender expectations that puts care on mothers as a burden, an extra burden for women. So at the same time, supporting groups to be agents of change, but then also being careful with this maternalist narrative that frame women as caregivers. So that's something that we'll need to address as well. So thank you very much. Obrigada. Gracias is my contact if anybody would like to discuss this more. And thank you for the time.